Alright, so evolution. So the first thing that we look at in evolution is something called common ancestry. Okay, so it's a theory that all organisms on the earth have come from one common ancestor. So all the genes on earth have come from one common ancestor. They've changed, but they all come from one place. Another theory is the descent with modification. So the passing of traits from parents to offspring, when genes are crossed and mated, they mix and may change or mutate. So this is kind of where it happens, like you don't look exactly like your mom or exactly like your dad, but you look sort of like both of them, right? So when they made you, their genes kind of mixed together and changed, and they made a different person that was sort of like them, but not exactly like them. Okay, so this is just kind of the evolution of a horse. So they started with a common ancestor, which broke into a few different ancestors, and then finally into the modern day horse.
Funny. You guys want to take a break?
Okay, so the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA, the last universal common ancestor is an organism from which all organisms have evolved. A 4 billion-year-old mystery surrounding the one common ancestor of all life on Earth has been solved by scientists. All life has evolved from the single-celled organism, the last common universal ancestor. So, at some point in time, one of your ancestors was just one little cell. That's all it was. Riley, can I get you to put your phone away, please, bud? Okay, so how does evolution occur? You don't just suddenly decide, well, I want my kids to fly, so I'm going to evolve wings. Okay, there's a couple different ways that evolution has occurred. So natural selection. Who's ever heard of natural selection? Or Darwin? Okay, so Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection. Sometimes you may have heard survival of the fittest. Okay, that's kind of where natural selection comes from. It's a process where organisms better adapt, which are better adapted to the environment, tend to survive and produce more offspring. And that kind of makes more sense, right? Like if there's an example of, it's called a pepper moth. So all the pepper moths used to be white, and they blended into the birch trees. And then the Industrial Revolutions came around, and that blew smog into the environment, which colored the birch trees gray, which meant now the white pepper moths stood out against the gray trees. So they weren't surviving, right? Birds were picking them off. Really easy, tasty treat. Some of the pepper moths were a little darker, so they blended in a little better, so they survived a little longer, so they had a few more kids. So now there are a few more gray pepper moths. A few more because those are surviving longer, and now the population of pepper moths in that area is totally gray because they were the fittest to survive in that environment. And then there's genetic drift, so a variation in the relative frequency of different genetic traits in a small population, owing to the chance disappearance of a particular gene as individuals die or do not reproduce. Okay, so this would be like if you have a small population of people who have red hair and they're stuck on an island. Okay, if everyone on that island to start has red hair, all their offspring are going to have red hair, right? Which means the genes on that island have now shifted to everyone having red hair. And that's going to be how that population changes. Okay, or another example here. So this first population had, a few green bugs and then a lot of brown bugs. And then most of the green bugs were killed out. So now the next population after that is going to have only a few green bugs because most of the bugs were killed out. All right, so some scientists that were important to this. Andre Vesalius. I think we've talked about Vesalius before. He studied anatomy. During his studies, he noticed that completely different species had similar pieces of anatomy. Because of this, we can see that these species evolved from a common ancestor. So if you look at this picture, we have the arm of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. They all look very different. They all do different things. But if we look at the bone structure, they all have a humerus. Okay, different sizes, but it's all there. They all have the radia and ulna, so the two bones that run through your forearm. They're all different, but they're all still there. They all have the carpals in your wrists. They all have the metacarpals in your hand and the phalanges in the fingers. They're all there. They're all different, but can you see how you could think of them as analogous? They do look similar. Does everyone kind of see that? They look similar, which means somewhere down the line, there was a common ancestor that gave the genes for all the bones in the forearm and the arm. Okay, so this is just kind of some proof of evolution, right? How else would we all have these same bones unless we came from something that was similar at some point in time? Okay, so William Harvey, another scientist, he's best known for looking at the circulatory system. That really doesn't help us now. He has some lesser known work in embryology, so the study of embryos, which are like the first beginnings of a new organism. Many of his theory led to modern theories of embryology. Many embryos of different species look very similar. All right, so on this picture, there is the embryo of a fish, a chicken, a human, a rabbit, a calf, a hog, a tortoise, and a salamander. Can anyone tell me which one they think might be the human?
The fourth one.
The fourth one? 1, 2, 3, 4, human. Rylan's at that one. Oh, does anyone else have a guess?
What were the animals again?
Okay, a fish, a chicken, a human, a rabbit, a calf, a hog, a tortoise, and a salamander.
I think the salamander is the first one.
You think the salamander?
I think human's the third last one.
Okay, so salamander. This one you think? For human?
No, human developers.
Shayna, what do you think? Do you want to give a guess? No? Okay, let's look at the next picture. Okay, so this is a little further on. Okay, so we said this one was the salamander, right? Salamander. And then I think Rylan said this one was a human, and Callan said this one was a human. Any other guesses from here?
I switch. The first one would be a fish, and the second one would be a salamander.
Okay. So fish, salamander. Any other guesses?
I think the last one would be a pig.
The last one's the pig. No idea?
Let's go to the next page.
I honestly can't tell. I think I might switch.
You think this one's a human, Shayna? What do you think?
I think I might switch mine one over to the left.
So this one?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. So originally, Rylan said this one was the human. Callan said this one was the human. Shayna said this one was the human once we got down one.
At least Tegan got hers right.
Tegan, when she flipped, yeah, that was right. So, can you see how this can also show us everything, almost all of these animals looked almost identical as early embryos, right? So it's easy to see how people say that evolution has happened. If all these different animals, even from different, like, big groups of species, right? Like, these aren't all mammals. There's some birds and reptiles in here. And fish, right? Whoops. So they all came from the same place. All right. Thomas Mathias. Mathias did not specifically write on evolution. His theories were on population. He argued that the world's food supply increased linearly. Okay, so linear increase looks like this. Well, its population size increased exponentially, and this is an exponential curve. Okay, so do you see how that could be an issue? right here, right there, it's pretty good. But once we get up to here, up to this exponential curve, the high side of the exponential curve, that's when people start having issues. So his book directly influenced Charles Darwin. In October 1838, I happened to read an amusing Matthias on population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on. It at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved. The unfavorable ones would be destroyed. The results of this would be the formation of new species. Here, then, I had at last got my theory by which to work. So Charles Darwin. So, he looked at what Matthias said about food and populations, and he used it to kind of shape his theory. Okay, so here's another evolutionary theorist who was super duper wrong. Okay, so Charles Baptiste Lamarck was the first to state that descent by modification occurs and that organisms become adapted to their environment. So one specific organism could become adapted to its environment. So Lamarck mistakenly saw that a desire for perfection was inherent in all living things. Inheritance of acquired characteristics was Lamarck's belief that organisms became adapted to their environment during their lifetime and passed these adaptations on to offspring. So the easiest way to view this is he thought, for example, a giraffe, if it needed to get its neck longer to get up to the top, would just grow a longer neck during its lifetime. Okay? And then pass those genes on to its offspring, which obviously isn't true. Giraffes can't just grow a longer neck. Okay? But what it could be true is the giraffes that had longer necks survived longer because they had a bigger food source, so then they passed on their traits to the next generation. Okay, Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace traveled around the world and collecting specimens. He noted that many places had the same species, but species were similar the closer they were located to each other. He and Darwin discussed their theories of evolution. Darwin was very surprised that Wallace's findings were so similar to his.
I'll send 20 back to work on our lines, please.
Alfred Wegener. Wegener was an astronomist who studied the map of the Earth and noticed that South America and Africa fit together like a puzzle. This idea led him to the theory that continents moved around the surface of the Earth. Okay, so if we think back to what Wallace said here, that the closer species were to each other, geographically, the closer they looked to each other, and then we kind of think about how Wegener thought about plate tectonics, it kind of makes sense, right? So if there are animals that are the same in both South America and Africa, but a little different, it's because when it was Pangea, when all the continents were together, okay, all the animals could move freely, then they separated, and animals got split. Okay? And then they evolved separately. Alright, Stephen Gould. Gould was a paleontologist, and he studied trilobite and horse evolution. He was expecting to find a very smooth, gradual change in the way species looked. Instead, he found very quick changes. He coined the term punctuated equilibrium. So there's the first thing that he thought he was going to see was kind of a gradual equilibrium. So he thought he would see one butterfly and it would split, one would get a little lighter and one would get a little darker. And then they'd keep going. The dark one would get even darker, the lighter one would get even lighter, until you had two butterflies that were totally separate. Okay, what he actually saw was this punctuated equilibrium. So one butterfly eventually evolved into another one, just kind of like bang in the timescape of all things. And then it evolved into another butterfly, just bang. And those evolved into different butterflies. Okay, Darwin's finches. The finches are what helped Darwin do a lot of his research and figure out his theories. So in 1831, Charles Darwin traveled to an island in the Galapagos. Darwin identified 13 species of finches among the Galapagos Islands that were primarily differentiated by beak size. In contrast, only one species of the bird existed on the mainland South America to the east. Darwin correctly concluded that the different beaks were adaptations to different diets among the islands. Darwin ultimately generalized that the observation from the finches that any population consists of individuals that are slightly different from one another. Furthermore, individual organisms having a phenotype characteristic, so phenotype is just what you see, providing them an advantage to stay alive, to successfully reproduce, will pass their phenotype traits more frequently to the next generation. Over time, the generations, the traits providing reproductive advantages become more common within a population. Darwin called this process descent with modification. Adaptive radiation, as observed by Charles Darwin in the Galapagos finches, is consequently an allotropic speciation among island population. So that's just a really long and fancy way of saying Darwin saw these finches. He saw that their beaks were different. He saw that the foods on the islands that they lived on were different. And he noticed that the beaks that they had would make it easier for them to eat the food that was available. So then he thought the animals that are able to eat the food are going to live longer. They're going to pass on genes because they're going to have more babies, which means their babies having the better genes to eat the food, again, they're going to live longer, have more babies, pass them on. So that gene for the better beak is going to be passed on more frequently, therefore more babies, more good finches. Okay, so this is a diagram of his different finches. And you can see it kind of splits off into what they ate differently. So these insect-eating finches, they all have kind of like round, pointed beaks. So they could jab the insect and crunch them up. The cactus-eating finches, you notice their beaks are a little longer because they want to get around the spikes of the cactus. Okay. All right, Darwin. Natural selection is the engine that drives evolution. Okay, that's really important. Natural selection drives evolution. The organisms best suited to survive in their particular circumstances have a greater chance of passing their traits to the next generation. It's easier for them to have babies because they can live longer in their environment. But plants and animals interact in complex ways with each other and their environment. These factors work together to produce the amazing diverse range of life forms present on Earth. Charles Darwin coined the term natural selection. You typically hear it alongside the often misunderstood evolutionary catchphrase of survival of the fittest. But survival of the fittest isn't necessarily the bloody tooth and claw battle for survival that we tend to think it ought to be, although sometimes it is. Rather, it's a measure of how effective a tree is at dispersing seeds, a fish's ability to find a safe spawning ground before laying her eggs, and the skill at which a bird retrieves a seed from a deep, fragrant cup of flour, and a bacterium's resistance to antibiotics. Okay, so survival of the fittest doesn't always mean that two apes go out into the forest and beat each other up and the one that's strongest lives. It's sometimes a lot more nuanced than that. Okay. Organisms have variations. This is another important part of evolution. If there is no variation between organisms, there would be no evolution. Every organism was always the same. They would stay always the same. In contrast to the previous world views, where imperfections were to be ignored, variations are essential for natural selection. Darwin suspected, but could not have seen today's evidence, that the occurrence of variation is completely random. New variations are as likely to be harmful as they are helpful. Variations that make adaptation possible are those that are passed from generation to generation. Darwin could not state the cause of variation because genetics was not yet established. So variations usually happen because some gene has changed somewhere. I heard a theory once that humans started developing from monkeys because there's a muscle in your jaw that wraps around the back of your head. Okay? In monkeys, that muscle is very, very strong, which means their cranium stays small because there's not enough pressure to push that muscle out to make the cranium grow large. Okay? The theory that I've heard is that the first monkeys to start evolving away from that common ancestor had a gene that made that muscle faulty. It made it weaker, which meant their cranium got larger. Right? And as your cranium gets larger, your brain gets larger. And as your brain gets larger, you get smarter. So brains just kept getting bigger. And now we have, if you look at a chimp and you look at us, the size of our heads compared to our bodies, right? Our bigger brains mean that we're smarter and we're able to do the things that we can do today. That's just a theory. I don't know. Theories are usually, you can't test them to see if they're true. But it does sound like a pretty possible theory, right? If that muscle let our craniums get bigger over time and our heads got as big as they are now, it makes sense that we're as smart as we are. So organisms must struggle to exist. Mathias proposed that human populations outgrow food supplies and death and famine were inevitable. Darwin applies this to all organisms. Resources are not sufficient for all members to survive. Therefore, there is a constant struggle for existence. Only certain members survive and reproduce. Right? If everyone was able to just survive and reproduce, didn't have to worry about where their next meal was coming from, nothing would change because no one would have to struggle to stay alive. Right? We'd all just be kind of comfy and cushy and eating what we want and doing what we want and having as many babies as we want. But that's not always the case for all species, right? Food becomes scarce. Resources, such as water, become scarce. So they have to adapt to the situation. And organisms differ in fitness. So organisms whose traits enable them to reproduce to a greater degree have a greater fitness. Darwin noted that humans carry out artificial selection. That copied twice. Early humans likely selected wolf variants to produce a variety of domestic dogs. Okay, so the wolves came to where they were living and probably lived around where their garbage was dumped, and they noticed, hey, when I have a wolf around, other animals don't bug me. So maybe I want to try and keep this wolf close to me. And the wolves were like, hey, if I hang out here, I get a good meal. So they started selecting the good puppies, the ones that were calm and loyal and easy to train, and they started breeding those ones. If you breed 2 loyal dogs, you're going to get a bunch of loyal puppies. So they kept doing that and doing that and doing that until you end up with today's domestic dogs. And that's how all the different breeds of dogs came about too, right? Someone said, I want a dog with a smushed in face. So they found the puppies that had the most smushed in faces, and they bred those together. The puppies out of that had the most smushed in faces got bred together. And then eventually you got a pug. Many crop plant variants can be traced to a single ancestor. Has anyone ever seen a picture of maize before it had been domesticated into corn? It's really tiny. It kind of looks like this. Not very filling, right? But if you pick a good one, plant those seeds, you're going to get some better ones. Pick the better ones, and eventually you get your really nice corn that's all juicy and sweet and good. Evolution by artificial or natural selection occurs when more fit organisms reproduce and leave more offspring. Okay, does this kind of evolution thing kind of make sense? How we kind of just keep going? Okay. All right, and then finally, organisms become adapted. An adaptation is a trait that helps an organism be more suited to its environment. Related organisms living in the same environment often display similar traits. Because of the differential reproduction, adaptive traits increase with each successive generation. So the more babies that are born, the more those traits are found. All right, done. Cool. So,